Well, I don't want to step ahead of you because if you all have some questions you want to ask
yes,
me.
we do. Yes, we do.
Go on.
Well, before we go forward, I just want to say, Chris, I don't know if you can see me on Skype, so what I'm using right now is I'm using the chat room to send you directorial situations here.
Yeah, I got it. I see you want me to go to number 3.
Please do, sir.
I'm on it, buddy. I am on it. Did anyone else in your family have these gifts or abilities? Great question.
Yeah, they did, actually.
Cool.
And I'm glad you asked that. Well, my mother and my father, and apparently my grandmother on my father's side, nobody told me those things as I was growing up, however. My mother used to pretend that, she didn't even hear me talking about stuff like that. Nobody wanted to admit that, God forbid, they were psychic or intuitive. You're really talking about, it was the 50s and 60s. In the early 70s, things were changing a little bit, but nobody wanted to discuss that. My grandmother died when I was 7, and she would come back to me, and I knew, I had conversations with her, and I knew she was there, and I understood it. But again, I couldn't talk about it. So, and I found out as well, probably, about, I was about 45 years old when I found out that my cousin, my first cousin on my father's side, used to go into trances. But she's afraid of all of this, so she told me I should go to a psychiatrist and get some pills, and it'll go away. And I thought, I can't do that. That's not me. I need to use my gifts like you do,
It's interesting.
Victor, you see these questions in the chat room that Christian's coming up with?
They're great questions, but they have to wait for the second hour because that's when we're going to be talking about that. So
yeah.
just be aware.
I just want to make sure that we're getting them down because those are good questions. I want to ask them in the second hour for sure.
Absolutely. So in any event, and I want to tell the people in the chat room, forgive me, I'm trying to manage the network tonight because Chris, Denny and Tiff's network is down. I'm handling the whole thing myself, so I'm balancing between getting the interview going with Eden and Chris and watching and monitoring the sound levels and making sure you all can hear and like juggling 25 balls in the air. And I am a multitasker, but this is a little bit beyond my capability tonight, so please bear with me. If I'm not responding to you in the chat room, it's not that I'm ignoring you. I just don't have that many hands that I can type and do everything else at the same time. But getting back to what Eden was saying, it's interesting, Eden, you said you were 7 when your grandmother appeared. I was 7 when my grandfather appeared to me. Did you grow up in New York?
Yes. Well, I grew up in Manhattan. Actually, until I was, how old? Probably about 7.
Right.
Then we were back in New York. We were in Greenwich Village, Flushing, and then New Jersey for a few years.
Okay.
And then by 7, I was in Manhattan and in Bucks County, Pennsylvania.
Now, just out of curiosity, your grandmother who appeared to you, what was her lineage?
Meaning?
Where did her people come from?
Oh, okay. I'm not 100% sure. I believe somewhere in Russia or Lithuania. I know some of my family on my father's side came from Lithuania, and she was my father's mother.
Okay.
And, I don't know a lot about her. But my father would very limited things that he would say. He would say things like, moonstones are not good for anyone in our family. And God knows why he would even bring that up. I think I was a teenager when he said that.
Wow.
And then he would say that your grandmother used to know things too. I would always, the phone would ring, and I would always say who it was. Or someone was going to come to the house, I would tell, my parents who was coming. I would say, so-and-so's coming over, and then they'd drive up. Or, we get a letter in the mail. That was in the days, kiddies, before we had personal computers, way before.
Wow.
So, yeah. And, they used to get pretty upset. And then I would tell them about, who was walking around in the house and that sort of thing. Because when I was a teenager, I finally, at least at home, was getting really tired of hiding this. Or my uncle, who was a film producer, and he used to make movies. He and Peter O'Toole were partners and made movies like The Lion in Winter and The Ruling Class and some outrageous films. He and my aunt lived in London. And every time Uncle Jules would come over, if he hadn't told my father and nobody knew, I would say, you know what, Aunt Joyce and Uncle Jules are here, or Uncle Jules is here, and I'd call, the hotel where I usually stayed and freak him out because nobody could sort of hide from me. Yeah, so
wow,
know, yeah.
That's a great share.
Yeah.
You mentioned that your family frequently traveled and moved. What was the reason for that?
My father decided to retire at a very young age, and he'd always wanted to live in Spain. Mm-hmm. And I often wonder, I wish he had leveled with me about it too. I know he told me that after we moved away from our home in Bucks County and he sold it, he said he had thought when we were living in it that he'd never get out alive. And I thought that was really wild that he said that.
Wow.
So I almost wonder if part of his decision to move, retire and move so young was based on that as well, because it was a really scary house. It was almost 200 years old. We lived there. Yeah.
Oh, 200 years old. Hold on one second. My sister lives in a house that's like 150 years old. Nothing scary about it, but there are a lot of friggin' spirits there. But well, a lot. But you know what? They're not bad. They just linger around. When I go there, if I bring my EVP recorders, we get amazing EVPs. I did a seance there once, and I want to say like 22 spirits came through that were living in the house, which is absolutely ridiculous.
Wow.
Spirits to come through in a seance. So I love those old homes.
Wow.
But so how many of the places that your family moved to were actively haunted, and what was it like living in them?
Well, okay. The first apartment that I remember being haunted myself was the one where the dead lady was in the bathtub, and I used to play with this little boy who nobody else saw. Those were the only two people souls that I really knew in that apartment. There were others in the building that scared me, and I'm sorry, you asked me how many homes there were that were haunted?
How many of them were actually actively haunted, and what was it like living in them?
Well, that one was actually haunted, and while it was a really great apartment, it was very frightening, because what was frightening was not who was in. I mean, I was afraid of the woman in the tub. Believe me, she terrified the hell out of me. The little boy was my friend. But I just, was afraid, like at night, because my room and my brother's room opened up on this bathroom. And I remember, as a matter of fact, I remember talking to another psychic medium, and she was saying the same thing. It was very funny. I said, I had all of these stuffed animals. I had one in particular whom I thought was my direct link to God. His name was Sooty, and he was a bear. And I would talk to him every night, and I really think it was my guardian angel that he was like sort of channeling for me. But I would surround myself with all these animals, like, however many, 15 of them in the bed to try to keep me safe. So, I had a lot of fears of things that I would see at night, and sometimes I'd hear things, and, other things would come in that, I didn't know who they were or what they were, but it would just frighten me. And as I said, my parents didn't really listen. So when we moved out of there full-time and we were living in our house in Bucks County, that was going from the frying pan into the fire. Oh, my God, because when my parents bought it, I was 7, and it was 175 years old at the time. And it had been a farm, and there were a lot of really frightening things happening in there. It was terrible. I mean, we had a full-time maid who would live in there with us. She would stay 5 days a week, and she was afraid. Nobody could stay in the house alone. I mean, if my parents were staying in the apartment in New York and she was going to stay there at the farm, then the housekeeper who used to come in, in the daytime, she lived in her own home, she would have to come and stay overnight with the maid because the house was so scary. The lights would turn on and off.
Before you go on, so it was scary. Was it scary because, there were spirits there and you were feeling that they were there, or was it a bad energy that you were feeling? Did you feel that it was a negative?
Right.
There was something negative there?
Yeah, there were different energies there, and the majority of it was one particular man who was really unpleasant. I mean, there was one man who loved the house, and he was the last owner of the house before Dad bought it. And he used to appear a lot in the kitchen because he and his wife had renovated, and they had built on this part between the old smokehouse and the the existing home. So he used to appear in there a lot. And he was okay. He just, he would scare me because I wasn't expecting it. I'd come downstairs and boom, this face. He used to come with his face. Just, I would see that, and a lot of times I would see it in the cabinets, which were a dark cherry color. I don't know why he would do that. And he would move things around in the kitchen so we would know he was there. And then he used to drive my father crazy because he would turn the heat on and off in that part of the house. There were many zones, I think 7 zones in the house, because it was so old. People need to realize that an old house like that doesn't have heating throughout, and it doesn't have insulation. So, when you buy a house like that, if you want to heat it, you end up having, space heaters and baseboard heaters, so to speak, that are run by circuits and electricity, but they're usually, so many rooms or one floor will have this kind of circuit and then the other. And so he wasn't bad, but, he did give me a little bit of the willies, and he scared the hell out of the maid. But there was this really awful curmudgeon, this really nasty man, and we had a lot of dogs. I mean, I grew up with a lot of animals, which was wonderful, and probably part of why I want to do this work with animals. And so at the time that this very unpleasant man started to show himself, it was more so around the time I was about 11 or 12. And, my friends would come over, and my brother was much younger than I, and we'd all, go outside and go into the barn and go snooping around because it hadn't been a working barn in like 50 years or something. And he would show up in there, and I would see him. Nobody else would, but they would hear him, and our dogs would hear him. And we had a huge collie, and we had a Dalmatian, and then we had my poodle, and the Yorkies were always in the house. They didn't come out with us. And the collie would try to jump into your arms, or the Dalmatian. They would be so terrified. They would be crying and squealing. And then you'd hear this thunderous voice of this man, "Get out of here!" And my friends were like crazed because we knew there wasn't anybody there. Oh my God! We go running into the house screaming, and it was very
Everybody heard this, not just you.
Oh, not just me. No, they heard it too.
That's pretty awesome, man. Okay, cool, very cool.
They heard it too. And inside the house, as I got older, and I started having, friends come over, and, several friends at a time on a weekend. I went to a boarding school, but I was a day student, so a lot of times I'd take boarders home on the weekend. They'd come and hang out with us. So we had a big house, and they'd come, and they'd be staying in guest rooms, but if there were too many of them, sometimes my mother would say, fine, let them sleep in the living room or whatever. And I remember them saying things like, why were you walking around at like 2 a.m, and you were humming? So there was a woman who used to walk around, and she would hum. And everybody who saw her in like a long white sort of nightgown. I don't know who she was. She seemed to have, to me, gray hair kind of up in a bun, and she was very sweet. She didn't do anything scary or whatever. So, there was that. And then there was one who would walk up the stairs, scare the hell out of everybody. You'd hear footsteps, no one was there. And then the lights, you'd hear the light switches turning on and off. They were very, you'd hear a very specific sound. And doors opening and closing, and wooden floors creaking. Oh, my God, the classic haunted house kind of thing. Oh, Lord. I could go on. I mean, I have stories that just, ooh.
What place made the biggest impression on you?
In terms of being fearful
haunted.
of it, or
whatever made the most
London.
impression in terms of spirituality and haunting.
Well, I would say the most negative. Okay, the one in Bucks County had a lot of fearsome beings in there, and actually that harkens back to Hans Holzer, which I know we want to get into in a little bit. But